Hello and welcome to Class 1 of LIS 539, Introduction to Metadata. So I wanted to just introduce myself, and then I have a few things to share with you for this week, and then after that we'll have a weekly lecture that'll be a little bit more structured than what I'm going to do today. So today I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about class, introduce myself so you can know a little bit more about me. So I've worked on metadata projects. I've worked with digital humanities. I've worked some with the Digital Public Library of America on various projects. I've done some programming and coding and migration of data. I'm coming off of a data migration project right now, so just finished that up last week. And traditional cataloging. So I have literally been in sort of the middle of all of the metadata things. I think that brings, for me, that brings a very broad knowledge of metadata and a real understanding for how this data connects to everything. That's me. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be sharing more information about, how to get in touch with me and things like that. Will be checking on in the class space every day. That's my intent, is to at least check in every day. I'm not going to necessarily be grading every day, because of when the deadlines are and things like that, but I will be checking in and certainly answering questions and things like that. We will have a TA. I'm still in the process of finalizing all that. So as soon as that all gets done, I will post that information. As always, please pay attention to the dates. I've tried to be very clear when things are due and make sure that our calendar is very organized. So on that note, our syllabus highlights. This is all in the syllabus. It's, all in Canva. It's all there for you to see. First week, we're talking introducing ourselves, getting to know everybody, and we're talking about ethics and metadata. Now, will this be the last time that you'll be thinking about this? We will have discussion this week. So yay. We'll be talking more about that. Week 2, we're going to look at some key issues and metadata. And again, we're going to have a discussion. Discussion is graded, so make sure to pay attention to the questions, answer the questions in your discussion. Include hyperlinks. If there's a resource, if I'm asking you to share a resource, include a resource, make sure to link to it so that we can take a look at it. Week 3, this is where we'll start to explore user collection and analysis, and this is going to be where your first assignment is going to come into play. So this will be where you will be defining a collection and scope. So you're really going to be thinking more about, what this project will look like. We're going to then dive into metadata schemas and frameworks. And here you will do a lot of exploration on your own. I will talk about some common metadata schemas and frameworks, and we'll look at some of these. Be up to you based upon what you've decided to do as your project, what the collection is and what its scope is. Then you will use that to then help guide your decision making in terms of which schema you want to use. Week 5, we're going to talk about controlled vocabularies, and we will then do an assignment where you are exploring and evaluating metadata schemas. So that will be your second assignment that will build on your, build towards your report. And I see my cat's wandering in. Oh, well. Week 6, we will have, we will talk about data manipulation and crosswalks, and we will have a discussion. The discussion will be on controlled vocabularies. I've tried to kind of separate it out with 1 week you have an assignment, or if you have an assignment, then you don't also have to do a discussion exercise. So to give you a little bit of a break, we'll talk about data manipulations and crosswalks. There will not be, there will be discussion there, but that will be on controlled vocabularies. Week 7, we'll talk about data migration and quality control, one of my topics that is near and dear to my heart. This will be the week that assignment 3, which will be your controlled vocabulary evaluation and selection, that's when that will be due. Week 8, we will talk about workflow creation and analysis, and we'll have an assignment discussion there. Week 9, we're going to wrap up looking at the future, and that's really where we're going to get to talk about AI a whole bunch, and we will have that final discussion. So that's sort of the scope of this class, and I hope it sounds like it's going to be fun for you, because I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and I've tried to make it as practical as I can be. So, as I noted in my announcements, we do have a few textbooks. One of the textbooks is getting a little bit old, but it does still have some good relevant content. So let's talk about the terminology, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some examples of metadata use. And then finally, I'm just going to wrap up very briefly with metadata for everybody. So, I think one of the things to me that's the most interesting about metadata is when you start looking at it, it really feels like it runs the world. I mean, it is the thing that connects all the resources together. So when we think about like all of our smart devices and the internet, this idea of the internet of things, we have all these devices that are connected together. Well, what makes that connection happen? Well, it's the mechanics, right? So it's the protocols and the mechanics of being able to transfer the networks and the bandwidth and all that kind of stuff, right? To make the connection. But then how does the computer and the machines know what they're supposed to do once they've made that connection? How do they know how they're going to use that information, or what information is coming to them, or where that information should go once they get it? That's really what the metadata does. So it's like when we start talking about or thinking about this concept of the semantic web, which has been around for a very long time now, the idea of the semantic web is the data aspect of what's going on. The idea of the Internet of Things, those are the actual devices connecting to each other. So they work together. The Internet of Things is all those devices that are connecting together. And then the semantic web is the data piece of it that is, telling the devices, what device is this and who does it belong to? And it's connecting to your smart speaker. And then you ask a question of the smart speaker and it goes and it looks and it queries. And what's that query? What's it querying? It's querying content, and it's using that to mine for metadata as well. So, I think of it kind of like that, where it's like these two things are working together. The semantic web piece of it, the data piece of it is helping, and semantic, helping the web make sense of the data. So, our metadata just feeds all into that. I mean, it's a much larger data landscape than even just metadata. And we'll talk a little bit about different types of metadata in just a second. But it really is about this just worldview of metadata. And then, of course, like I said, with all the devices that we use and things like that. So I think of it like the programming languages are like and the protocols and things like that. They're like the engines that are running everything. And then the metadata is like the street signs and the maps that tell things where to get to and what those things are named and what kind of thing they are. It's a road, it's the ocean, it's a lake, it's mountains, whatever it may be. It's telling information to all those machines that are just going away doing all their things. And the communication can be very specific about the content. And this is really what we start thinking of with the description, right? When we are describing a resource. Like when we do traditional cataloging, we're describing a resource that a library or institution owns or acquires or has access to, has licensed it. We describe that resource, its title, who created it, when that resource was created, all that kind of stuff is so large. And I love this graphic because it talks about different kinds of data. It talks about information retrieval and dissemination, which is certainly an important thing we want to do, that we want people to be able to find what they're looking for and to be able to access it. Ownerships and rights management. And we just saw recently Steamboat Willie is now out of copyright. So there's a whole interesting conversation about ownership. And copyright falls into that rights management and ownership piece of it. Also managing users. And we don't think too much about this sometimes unless we're a person who maybe is working on a system side where we have to set up user accounts, or we assign permissions, or maybe you need to get permissions assigned so that you can do a particular task. That's when we sometimes think about user management. But all of that information about the users, their name, if it has their date of birth in it, your university ID, all of that is metadata. And then, of course, we have resource description metadata, description about resources. That's probably one of the things that people working in libraries are most commonly associated with. We think about that in terms of metadata. We don't always think about all these other things as metadata, but they are. But we do think about resource description, or sometimes we call it cataloging, same thing as metadata. But there's so much that we do beyond just that. We also do have retention depend upon, what kind of library you're working in or want to work in. Certainly, if you work in an academic institution or you work for the government, there's preservation and retention policies associated with everything. It may be associated with your email. It may be associated with, particular reports and budgets and things like that. That preservation and retention, the policies, and not only the policies, but the policies as they are represented in the data. That data piece of it is also the metadata piece of it. Also, this can be preservation metadata can also get to if you have something where maybe you've made a surrogate of that record or a surrogate of that resource. So it's a resource that is perhaps too fragile to handle. And so you've digitized it or photographed it so that there would be some representation of it. Then that process, dependent upon, that's not true for every library and archive, but some archives and libraries very much want to track the whole width of that particular resource, even as a digital object. What was the path that that digital object took in terms of getting created and getting and being preserved or converted or compressed, or any of the things that may happen to digital files. So I like this. It's a very old graphic. They gave me permission a long time ago to use it. I hope they still are okay with that, because I still use it. But this really talks about kind of all the different ways that we get content contributed to us. And when we start thinking about this as a broad, just landscape of all these different kinds of resources that are out there. I mean, certain libraries get all kinds of things, right? We get photographs given to us. We have documents. We have documents we create. We get given documents. If we have an institutional repository, we're collecting documents. I mean, we just have all kinds of things, right? We may be archiving and collecting web pages like the Internet Archive does, and some of the other projects out there that do that. Multimedia, certainly I think we're seeing more multimedia coming into archives these days than maybe a few years ago, just because so much of the content we create is now digital. And so there's certainly a rise in more digital content coming into special collections and archives, and really all media formats. So we have things that come into us that are very similar to this as well. But in addition to all the different formats of material, there's tons of different kinds of people. What I think of as our peers of practice, these are people who are communities of practice that are similar to us, or maybe not similar to us, but they're doing similar work. So we might not think as broadcasting, or we might not think of community members as doing similar work to us, but there are people in the community who are doing similar work. They may be genealogists, they may be historians, they may be working on more of a digital archives approach. I recently saw a short snippet of a person who started collecting when he was thrifting and going to thrift stores. He started collecting photographs and purchasing them, and then he put up a website to try to see if he could reunite people, with their photographs, or their family members with the photographs. And of course, in order to do that, you have to have the resources, but he had the resources that he had acquired in his purchasing at thrift shops, but then you need someone to describe them and be able to explain them and all of that kind of stuff. That description piece of it. So, there are, when you start looking out around you, there are most likely people who are doing some kind of work that's similar to us. Even if it's just people who go in and maybe do, maybe they do reviews on Google, and but when they tag that place, or when they correct the name of a place, or they give a review, I mean, all of that is building metadata. So we have all of this contributed metadata coming from wherever, including us. We create it both in our own lives and professionally. And then, of course, the output of that in an idealistic world is that content's easier to find. And this can be kind of questionable these days, because we have so much content that it is not easy to kind of wade through all of it for sure. So, the better the data, that can help facilitate some of that. We have other things that need to happen, search engines need to be better, all that kind of stuff. But in theory, content is easier to find. It's easier for us to then share with other people, and it can be easier for us to reuse or to be able to build on, if we're allowed to do that with the rights that are associated with that content. So there's a lot of things that we can do with the content that's then created. So we will mostly in this class be focused on descriptive metadata. That's probably where you all will see the most discussion of metadata, is really that resource description. But as you are looking at metadata schemas, and as you are doing your readings, I also want you to think about structural and administrative metadata. And it's going to depend upon the schema that you use, or that you choose, and the ones that you are investigating, in terms of how much of this you will see. Some of them lean much more into administrative metadata, where they want to record provenance and a lot more information about the state of the resource, who owned the resource, the rights, the licensing, the tracking of that resource throughout time, all of the things that happen to that resource along the way. Other schemas you'll look at will be almost entirely description, and descriptive with very little structural or administrative aspects to it. However, it is worth knowing what these terms are, because when you start going out into the larger metadata landscape and you start looking at metadata, I want you just to be aware that it's not all description. You may be looking at a schema that is primarily description, someone else may be looking at one that's not, or you may have one that's a little bit of both. But when you start looking in the broader landscape, especially if you start looking at communities of practice outside of libraries and archives and digital humanities, you're going to see a lot more interest in structural and administrative metadata. I worked in a manufacturing industry as part of my graduate program. I was lucky just to kind of get invited to do that, and it was very interesting to me to see how their work was so similar to what I had been trained at as a student worker, and how it was so different, because they had much more need of administrative control. They had confidential prototypes. They had instructions that went to various factories, and those instructions had to be very tightly controlled, very tightly version controlled, and when instructions needed to be updated, those former instructions had to be pulled and actually destroyed. I mean, everything had this very strong retention policy and management policy. So they had much more structural and administrative data, because structural data in terms of how things were related to each other, administrative data in terms of how you had to oversee all of those materials. So it was very interesting to me to see a place that I wouldn't have thought necessarily before working there that would have such a strong focus on metadata, and then what that would look like. So this is something that I have kind of put together based upon what I've seen elsewhere. And GLAM, I just sort of use that. It's been around forever as a term. It means galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. I just did it to kind of shorten things. But one way to kind of think about metadata as we're looking at it is to kind of break it down in your head between the framework, and the framework can be, the framework that you have can be the schema. So that can be part of the sort of what the framework is, the data content. And this would be what we really think of as the resource description piece of it. Like, how do I know how to construct a title? How do I know what name to choose? How do I know what information to put in about the publisher? What format do I follow for that? What best practice do I follow for that? So the data content, that's the data the content that goes into the data, and typically resource description. The data format. In libraries, we often see MARC, and MARC's an interesting space because since it's been around for so long, MARC is both a format and a framework. So this is one of the reasons why for library stuff, we're kind of stuck. We've been kind of stuck with MARC for a while because it kind of serves two purposes. It is both the framework, so it's not a schema, but it's similar to a schema. And it is also a file format. There's actually a MARC file format. Now, more recently, thank goodness, there was a effort to try to find a way to make MARC more flexible. Early days, when you did MARC records, you just had a MARC file format and that was it. There was no translating it to anything else or converting it to anything else. But as XML kind of became more popular, there was a move to be able to take MARC and to, I say translate it, but to convert it into an XML format, which gives it much more flexibility. You're going to be reading about XML a little bit later on. XML stands for Extensible Markup Language, and you don't have to know all the ins and outs of XML for this class. You do not need to know how to create XML for this class. However, if you are working with metadata, you are going to eventually be exposed to XML, and you will need to work with XML. There are tools out there. There are editors out there to create XML. There's converter tools that'll take MARC and convert it right over to XML. So, it's not something where you need to suddenly need to know coding for this. You don't, but you do need to be aware that XML is one of the most common tools. And you see here data format across digital humanities, across libraries and bibliographic data, and also across archival management. XML is a standard in terms of a format for this kind of data. And not only is it a standard, but when we start talking about crosswalking in a few weeks, XML is key when it comes to MARC crosswalking. So some other projects have a little bit more flexibility, and we'll talk a little bit more about these when we get to crosswalking, but definitely the reason why you're reading about XML is because as a metadata practitioner, it is an unavoidable thing. You may not need to know to program it, but when you are going to be dealing with importing or exporting records or trying to move records from one thing to another, you're most likely going to encounter XML somewhere along the way. And then we have data exchange protocols, and this is the protocol for how we exchange data between systems, between repositories. If you've heard terms like harvest or ingest, harvest means that you're going out using software to, typically software, a machine, to go out to another project that has given you permission to do it and has set up the protocol so that you can do it. You go out and you harvest or collect their resources or data. Ingest means that you are then putting those resources or data into your software or website or wherever you're putting your resources. So we'll talk more about that when we get to crosswalking, but I just wanted to kind of break this out in terms of the data structure or framework, the content itself, so that's the resource description, the data format, and then the data exchange protocols, because all of these are important to actually making metadata work in production. So when I was talking about how we have machines and the Internet of Things that talk to each other and they're moving data back and forth, that's a data exchange protocol. Typically, they're going to use things like APIs, but there's even things beyond that these days. So trying to keep it a little bit simple in terms of what we're doing. We'll talk more about data formats and data exchange protocols when we get to crosswalking. Just wanted to give you a little bit of a revisit this later. So in terms of that administrative description and structural metadata that I've already talked some about, I like this. This is an oldie but a goodie. I like this because it kind of breaks down the different pieces of it. So structure would be, it could be the relationship of a resource to something else. So it could be for a digital resource, it could be its position in a collection. For a website, it could be the folder that an image lives in. Or if you've organized your, say, your Facebook photos and albums, that relationship of the resource to the album, that's has structural metadata associated with it. It tells Facebook and all of its computers that in your account that there is a relationship between that photo and to that album. So that is that structural piece of it, how things are related together. So it can be at a sort of a very detailed level. You could say the pages of a book and how the pages of a book are related to the book as a whole. So like the table of contents would show you that. Or you can look at it even at a larger level, how a book is organized in a library and where that structure is in terms of the organization, what floor it lives on, what building it lives on, all of that kind of stuff. That structural piece of it, how it relates to that. Now you may think, oh, well, when I look in the library catalog for physical resources, it tells me that. Is that structural metadata? And yes, the answer is yes, but that's not always what we call it when we're looking at things like that. Sometimes with library data, we call that a holdings record because it shows what we hold and where it's located in a particular library. Description, this is the one we're most familiar with because we just see it all the time. This is things like the title of the book, the creator, when it was published, all that kind of things, subject headings, that kind of stuff, the summary of it. And then administrative metadata, we've already talked some about. It can include rights. Sometimes rights are separated out. Rights is such an expansive piece of metadata depending upon the community of practice that sometimes they separate out rights management, but it is a format of administrative metadata. It can also include things like information about the archive. It can include, who owns this resource, who digitized this resource, who's providing this resource, that kind of stuff. So we've already talked about this. Descriptive metadata is very common. It does help in discovery and identification. And, many of us work with this just every single day. And we've already talked about MARC records a little bit. Tags, titles, and notes in Flickr. These are harder to see if you still have a Flickr account, then you can see them if you go in and look at the metadata for your individual images. They're not so publicly available anymore. And that's one of the things we've seen with a lot of the social media is the metadata is there, but from a public standpoint, it's much harder to see this metadata. They've kind of put it behind everything. But Facebook does this as well. You'll read a very fun article about Facebook and tagging. Again, metadata. X has hashtags. Facebook uses hashtags. LinkedIn uses hashtags. Hashtags, for better or worse, are a form of descriptive metadata. There's also sometimes the ability to actually embed metadata into the code of websites. This was more popular in the earlier days of the internet, where there was a lot of push towards writing good descriptions of your website, which Google still likes, and also adding keywords. But then people misuse keywords, so keywords have kind of fallen out of favor. Google really focuses on the content itself, but it does when you actually search in Google and it brings up a website, that little blurb that comes up about the website comes from the description of the website. And that's typically embedded in the code of the website. And with a content management system, something like WordPress or Drupal or any of those kinds of things, there's typically information that it will ask you about your website. You just put in information and there's no coding to it. Really, any website where a user or authorized user, that can be one of us, can create or edit a description, that is typically going to be descriptive metadata. And I wanted to just touch on a couple of examples. I actually chose an AA02 record here, and I've kept it because they're shorter. AA02 is Anglo-American Cataloging Rules, and yes, the name's horrible. we did get away from it, or slowly getting away from it. But I just wanted to kind of point out, the differences in terms of what data can look like. This should be something that you've probably encountered, or you may have encountered something similar to this when you were looking at records. If not, when next time you're searching in the library catalog, just, take a look at the record and sort of think about it through the metadata lens. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time doing it, but just kind of think about it in terms of the metadata lens. Because one of the things that happens with the MARC record is we do have some information that is more structural. Now, in this case, we don't have a table of contents, but if we had a table of contents, that would give some structural aspect. We do have a series note here that says critical companions to popular contemporary writers. That series note and its relationship to this work, that's a structural. It's both structural and descriptive. It's explaining that this is part of a series, but the fact that it is coded as a series then provides the linking piece of it, and that's where we get to that structural metadata. We also have information up here at the 040, which the 040 is the library that created this record, and then the library who added to this record. That is a little bit of administrative metadata. Who actually worked on this record? That would be some of that administrative metadata. So, our metadata is generated from a lot of different resources. We look at the resource itself. It's typically descriptive, but just in that very brief example, we saw some other things that were not descriptive. But we also use controlled vocabularies, and that could be Library of Congress subject headings, Sears subject headings, genre terms. It could be a bunch of different things. We'll talk more about controlled vocabularies later on, but that certainly factors into the metadata that we create. And as I mentioned, even Google encourages best practices. So that's a piece of it that is so critical to metadata that sometimes, and I think the interview that will be coming up will be of very much interest, because the need that's expressed that we need good data so that we can find the resources, but people do not want to take the time to make the data good. That is the age-old challenge with this kind of work, the quality versus quantity. And especially when you start looking at machine-generated content and the ability to go out and harvest or go get or ingest 50,000 or 100,000 or whatever it may be, the numbers quickly scale beyond what an individual person can do. So how we can balance that quality versus quantity piece of it is very important, and best practices are one of the things that will be critical going forward. Even Google encourages best practices. They're not easy to find in Google. Those links should hopefully still work, but there is something that was formerly called Google Webmaster Tools, and I forget now what they call it, but it does have a list of questions to help guide the creation of content so that the content itself is more high quality. And then it also talks about what it looks for when it's evaluating content. So I mentioned crosswalking already. Crosswalking, just to kind of define that, is just getting data from one place to another. You know, this can be a lot of different ways to do that. We look just in that brief little chart that there's some protocols to use and things like that. We'll look more at those. I'll show you all some examples of that, and we'll talk more about how crosswalking works. But crosswalking is really just, for example, in a MARC record, it would be maybe taking a MARC record and we're going to, put non-MARC information from a non-MARC source into it. Or maybe we want to take MARC records and we want to put them into an institutional repository. Well, then we would need to have the MARC fields match up with what goes into the institutional repository. Or maybe we have an institutional repository or digital humanities project, and we want to go get resources from another project. We need the information to match up. For example, we need to be able to have the systems know title equals title. If it's title in one system and it's called first title in another system, then we need to tell our system, or the other way, it needs to tell us where that information goes. So, I really can't stress enough that metadata is everywhere. We see it even, oh, sorry, that got a little skewed there. We even see it in Microsoft products. So this still exists. Over here on the left is an older version of this, I think 2017 and 2023. There's still, the ability to capture metadata. Now, if you do an accessibility review and you do a grammar review and all of that kind of stuff, it will often ask you or prompt you, do you want to take a look at the metadata? And it doesn't ask you that, but it'll say something like, do you want to look at properties or look at properties next, or somehow it will guide you to the properties. And we're going to take a look at that in just a second. But if we don't do that, it either will create some data for us. And typically this is that it will save as the author, the person who initially created the document. Or if you are using a template, maybe you have borrowed a document for someone, or someone sent you a document and you're like, oh, that's a great template, I'll use that. It's going to keep their name as the author. And, even if you upload it to the web, sometimes that information still gets captured as part of that. So it is something important to take a look at when you're looking at your products that you're working with, especially if you're working with Microsoft products. But it really can be in any product that we work with, especially if you're looking at like authors and things like that. Structural metadata, I think we've already talked about this enough. I've given you a little bit more information here. I think about it often also in terms of, is something part of something else and how that relationship happens. It is often created by our systems or in the process of organizing resources. So if I am doing work and I upload an image to a repository or a website, and I then move it into a collection, Once I move it into that collection, that act of moving it into the collection will generate some of that structural metadata for me. Again, you can see structural metadata and administrative metadata and descriptive metadata in Microsoft. So when you go into Microsoft, if you go under File and Properties, you will be able to see sort of a variety of metadata, and it's just all sort of hodgepodge together. This is more typical when you get outside of projects and you just start looking at software. They won't tell you it's administrative or structural metadata or descriptive metadata. They'll just kind of give you, here's your properties, or here's information about this resource. And at that point, if you have your metadata hat on, you will start noticing some of these aspects of it. So I think that's one of the fun things about learning more about metadata is when you start looking at software, you will start seeing how it works or interacts with metadata. Or if you are, especially with things like social media, you'll be able to see from the mechanism, like, oh, I have a photo album, I put an image in my Facebook photo album. You'll understand that there's structural metadata there, even if you can't see it because the system doesn't clearly show it to us. Administrative metadata, we've already talked about it. I wanted to give you a little bit more of a definition. Rights management, and that includes really dealing with the intellectual property rights, and then it includes the preservation metadata. Again, these sometimes get split, especially in various communities where they're much more focused on preservation, or some communities are much more focused on rights management, and you will see those sometimes get split out as separate groups, which is fine, but they are still under that larger umbrella of administrative metadata. This is an example for the Civil Rights Digital Library. This was a little bit of an older example, but I did like the layout of it, so I kept it. You can see the descriptive data up here. So we have the creator, the title, the date, description, type, description, subjects. Ooh, lots of subjects. Yeah, I worked on this project. There's lots of subjects. Oh, lots of subjects. Description. And then we have down here some administrative metadata in the rights and usage. And then we even have here this persistent link to the item. This would be now it would be a URI. That sort of thing where you get like a persistent link, or you get some information that's related to the structure in terms of this is part of something else. Those kinds of things would fall into that structural metadata. So as I wrap up my talk here, that's kind of a little preview of some of the things we're going to be talking about in the upcoming week. I did want to talk more about what we're talking about today, which is issues and opportunities with metadata, especially through bias. One of the things that was really interesting to me was how hopeful the early days of the internet was. And there was sort of this belief that, the collective expertise of the group would rise to the top. The true or accurate information would rise to the top. I know some of you are probably laughing at that, but the internet was very optimistic in the early days of social media. And, the idea then was that the untrue stuff would sink to the bottom. It would get bad reviews, a place that doesn't have good food is going to get bad reviews. It's going to sink to the bottom. That's still kind of true, right? But, the problem with that is then people started sort of gaming the system, right? If they didn't like a place or a person, they might give it a bad review to try to push the ratings down, that kind of thing. For Wikipedia, which I think is one of the most interesting examples of this, the early promise of collective knowledge that, we'll all work together for the good of the world, really, to collect knowledge and to document it and to provide an authoritative source of information. Yes, you can still participate in Wikipedia. Lots of people do, but it's now really in the hands of an editorial board. So if you actually go in and you look at like the history of the changes of a Wikipedia entry, you'll see that a user may change, one of us may change something in Wikipedia, and then someone else will go back in and either reject that change, or maybe they'll tag it and say, we need more information, or they may even delete the entry as a whole if someone creates an entry and the editorial board or the group of people that is, it kind of goes up levels, but eventually there is that decision made of, this information is just not valid or true, or this person is not worthy of a Wikipedia article. And I know that gets into all kinds of really, uncomfortable discussions at time, who's making this decision and things like that. Wikipedia does recognize that they have bias, and they do have a lot of pages within Wikipedia talking about the bias and attempts to address the bias that they have. So I think there is an awareness of that, but it is thinking about, data being shared and data being created by a community. It's interesting to kind of think about, it kind of went from, oh, anybody can create a Wikipedia entry to, well, anybody can create it, but that doesn't mean it's going to stay, because there is that review process. So I think that piece of it is something that I want you to kind of think about as you're reading articles, and especially when we get to the artificial intelligence discussion at the end of this class, is where our role is in terms of reviewing and vetting data, and how our role may be shifting, especially as we look at how technology can help us in terms of creating more data, creating better data, but how our role may then shift to, being more of an oversight kind of role, or ensuring that the machines are creating accurate data. And of course, then that gets into the bias that we all have too. How our personal bias comes into play, how our experience, our beliefs, all of that in terms of how we interact and work with the data. And then on top of that, it's just like a cake, it's multiple layers. So then we also have the data infrastructure and the bias that's built into that, which is so important. The more we can do things to try to rectify that. And I just read recently, just a couple of weeks ago, that Facebook is retraining their has retrained their artificial intelligence image generator. And, for better or worse, it's used Instagram images and Facebook photos, which, who gave them permission to do that? But it's probably in our terms of service someplace. But to try to be more representative. But again, is that really representative if they're using their own community members? It's maybe representative of their community members in certain countries and at certain income levels that can afford to have those pieces of technology and can afford to do that, and also feel comfortable taking photographs of themselves. So, there's a lot of, yes, that would seem like it would be more inclusive if you're doing millions and millions of people, but just because the scale's big does not necessarily mean that it's truly representative or inclusive either. So it's not an easy problem to tackle by any means, and we're not going to solve it in this class by any means, but I do want everyone to kind of think about it, because it is so much a part of everything we do. And as we go forward with artificial intelligence, which it is not going away, it is here to stay. It's here to stay. And the more we take ourselves out of the mix, or think we can take ourselves out of the mix, the greater opportunity there is for artificial intelligence to create misinformation or to do wrong, because it's constantly learning, although it can't really truly learn because it doesn't truly have human cognition, but it is able to make sort of decisions about, like a 5 or 6-year-old does, but it's able to make some decisions. So if you do not tell if you do not review the output of artificial intelligence, and if you do not tell the artificial intelligence, no, I need to include more into your training models as Facebook has tried to do, or I need to try to be more inclusive with my training model, so maybe I should include these other things, or you do not tell it that it's wrong or that that information is not valid, then it's not going to know. And it just assumes it's correct. So the default so far with artificial intelligence seems to be, and I believe this is changing, but it seems to be, if you don't tell me I did it wrong, then I'm going to assume it's right. And I'm going to keep doing that. And I'm going to do more of it because you didn't correct it. So right now, how artificial intelligence works in terms of what, sort of what's available to us as a public, that's where we're seeing, problems happen, where data was dumped into artificial intelligence, and either someone intentionally, the data was bad, which is possible, someone intentionally injected misinformation or harmful language, and we could do that ourselves if we use our subject headings, some of which may have harmful language. If we put those in artificial intelligence, we don't tell artificial intelligence something different, then it's going to continue to use that. So we're in a very interesting place when it comes to, the potential for bias and the potential for misinformation, especially when we think about artificial intelligence. And what we need to focus on is, trying to look through the lens of being ethical and not only being data stewards. So, we're not data entry folks anymore. We're not data scribes anymore. We're not just creating data anymore. We have to be a data steward, but not only a data steward in terms of taking care of the data, but we have to constantly be evaluating the data and evaluating it against whether or not the data is good. And that being good data goes beyond whether or not it's accurate. It also goes to whether or not the data itself is ethical, whether or not it is representing what we need for our particular goals and what our projects need. So going forward, there are going to be so many ideas, issues that are out there because metadata is everywhere. So I think I went on a little longer than I intended. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your week. I'll be looking forward to your introductions and your discussions for this week. And I will be in touch, and I'll let you know about our TA as soon as I know something. Bye.